Chief Koya vividly remembered the time before the ships arrived. The vessel now anchored just beyond his village flew the American flag. Men and women loaded their canoes with otter skins, as was customary, and set out to trade. On board, Koya and his group met the esteemed Captain John Kendrick, a former naval hero of the American Revolutionary War. During their trade negotiations, Kendrick accused the villagers of stealing minor personal items from the ship. As a result, he had Chief Koya shackled by the leg and threatened to kill him unless the stolen items were returned. He then proceeded to punish him. Kendrick took Koya, tied a rope around his neck, whipped him, painted his face, cut off his hair, stripped him of many valuable skins, and then cast him ashore. Kendrick sailed away, likely unaware of the force he had stirred. Europeans had not reached this archipelago, later known as Haida, until 1774. For millennia, the Haida people had ruled as a dominant naval power in these waters. The bones of their ancestors had been laid to rest on these islands for over 10,000 years. Their oral traditions, passed down through a line of elders, preserved memories of times when ice blanketed the land. These ancient stories taught values and expressed a deep spiritual bond with the island's creatures, orca whales, eagles, and ravens among them. Some believed it was a divine raven that freed the first humans from a shell. The Haida were deeply connected to the ocean, which provided them not only with sustenance, but also with wealth. In their massive cedar canoes, they would journey 60 miles or more across the sea to trade with or attack neighboring peoples. Clad in sea lion hide and wooden armor, they would land swiftly and with force. Villages fell quickly to their spears, arrows, clubs, and daggers. The Haida took prized treasures and captives, whom they enslaved, returning home in triumph. Their tradition of lightning-fast coastal raids earned them comparisons to the feared Vikings. Haida oral history spoke of the terror they inspired in their enemies, who wondered, what kind of people are these, who fear not even death, these Haidas? Periods of relative peace were often shattered by battles with other coastal peoples. Similarly armored and driven by the pursuit of loot, revenge for lost kin, or insults. The Haida did not cower before foreign ships, nor would they leave the humiliation of Chief Koya unpunished. 2 years later, Captain Kendrick returned, and this time, Koya and his people boarded the ship. At the start of their trading, they drew daggers and seized control of the ship's gun chests. Canoes poured out from the shore, their war songs echoing across the water. Koya pointed to his leg, daring Kendrick to chain him again. The captain pleaded for peace, but before long, a few of his crew broke from the cabin, armed with guns. The Haida scattered, leaping into their canoes or swimming back to shore. Kendrick's crew pursued the Haida in their armed boats, wreaking terrible havoc and killing everyone they encountered. Around 50 Haida were killed in the assault. Koya lost his wife, 2 children, and his status as chief. For in Haida society, the authority of chiefs was not absolute. It had to be continually earned. The people of Haida were divided into nobles, commoners, and slaves. Kinship lines were traced through the mother, and chiefs could be either men or women. However, leadership was not solely determined by bloodline. It had to be constantly reinforced through relationships and acts of generosity. This was done in ceremonial gatherings known as potlatches, where people danced, sang songs, and nobles displayed their status by giving away wealth. It was honor, bravery, and above all, generosity that earned followers and, in turn, conferred legitimacy on Haida leaders. Defeats had damaged Koya's standing among his people. A similar tragedy unfolded across the sea in the Hawaiian Islands. An American ship anchored at a village, where Captain Simon Metcalf invited the villagers to trade. Earlier, Metcalf had lost one of his men to the natives on Maui, and when unsuspecting villagers paddled out to meet him, he unleashed his cannons on them. Over 100 people were killed, their dismembered bodies left to drift in the tide, and Metcalf sailed away. Shortly after, subjects of the rising King Kamehameha of Hawaii killed the crew of another ship captained by Metcalf's son, capturing one prisoner and abducting one of Simon Metcalf's sailors. Simon made no attempt to rescue them, but instead fled to China to trade. In 1794, he returned, appearing in the gray waters off Koya's village. The Haida paddled out with their pelts, boarded the ship, and began trading. Metcalfe, now outnumbered, was soon aware of the Haida's presence. The warriors drew their daggers, stabbed him to death, and killed the rest of the crew, sparing only one sailor who had climbed into the rigging. They later ransomed him. These victories, seen as retribution for the earlier actions of white traders, brought the Haida combatants prestige and power. The following year, when a British ship fired on a Haida village, the crew was stunned when the villagers fired back using captured American cannons. The British ship fled. Such skirmishes were common, and Koya likely died in one of them. Yet, despite the violence, neither the Haida nor the British and American traders could ignore the value of this commerce. The Haida procured pelts with increasing ambition, while the influx of clothing, guns, and iron tools brought them both material prosperity and military dominance. Thus began the rise of Haida power. Along the shorelines, the most magnificent and monumental totem poles were raised. Haida warriors triumphed over their old enemies, and chiefs bestowed ever greater gifts upon their kin. Yet, this path to dominance relied on the island's resources as commodities. Sea otters, once abundant, disappeared in the face of global demand. As if that weren't enough, disease brought by. Contact with outsiders ravaged villages, causing widespread death. Commerce itself was tainted by violence. For every honest trader, there were still competitors who would kidnap Haida or destroy villages to secure a supply of furs. In the 1850s, outsiders came to mine gold on the islands, but the Haida refused to be conquered. Warriors harassed the miners, seizing their gold and ships. They burned the ships and held the crews for ransom. The ancient line of Haida warriors had stopped the gold rush. The Royal Navy's commander-in-chief of the Pacific Station was advised by a subordinate that no vessel should be allowed to trade in any part of these waters without being properly armed and manned, and in readiness to defend herself from insidious attacks. But it was smallpox that ultimately broke the islands in the latter half of the 19th century. Storied lineages were reduced to scab corpses and fevered survivors. Villages were abandoned, their remnants overtaken by nature, and they lived on only in the mournful gaze of the totem poles. The islands were claimed by the British and later by the Canadian government. Once home to a pre-contact population of around 15,000, by 1915 Haida Gwaii had only 588 inhabitants, about 4% of its original population. The Canadian government then set about eradicating the Haida's language and traditions, further threatening their identity and culture. The state banned potlatch ceremonies and forced Haida youth into distant, often abusive residential schools. Yet, the Haida people persisted, surviving the end of these policies in the latter half of the 20th century. Their numbers began to recover, and they returned to the land of their ancestors, rebuilding the connections that had been frayed, restoring the totem poles of their warrior ancestors and the songs of a people bound to the ocean. It's a powerful story of resilience, and I was reminded of something I never knew from the Life of Crazy Horse documentary, sponsored by today's sponsor, Wondrium. When he was younger, the Lakota warrior Crazy Horse had a vision that he would never be killed by bullets, and this vision became a source of his courage in battle. Honestly, go watch the whole thing. If you're interested in history that isn't always covered in mainstream sources, I think Wondrium is like walking into a museum, but one where everything is available at your fingertips. The state banned potlatch ceremonies and forced Haida youth into distant, often abusive residential schools. Yet, the Haida people persisted, surviving the end of these policies in the latter half of the 20th century. Their numbers began to recover, and they returned to the land of their ancestors, rebuilding the connections that had been frayed, restoring the totem poles of their warrior ancestors and the songs of a people bound to the ocean. It's a powerful story of resilience, and I was reminded of something I never knew from the Life of Crazy Horse documentary, sponsored by today's sponsor, Wondrium. When he was younger, the Lakota warrior Crazy Horse had a vision that he would never be killed by bullets, and this vision became a source of his courage in battle. Honestly, go watch the whole thing. If you're interested in history that isn't always covered in mainstream sources, I think Wondrium is like walking into a museum, but one where everything is available at your fingertips. If you're like me and want to learn new skills, whether it's painting like my brother Joe, learning a new language, or diving into photography, Wondrium has it all. They add new content regularly. And perhaps most importantly, all of the lessons and courses are taught by experts. The Crazy Horse documentary is presented by Professor Katrina Phillips. I personally prefer learning on my phone as a convenient alternative to mindless scrolling, but you can stream content on laptops, TVs, and tablets too.